Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Ozan Örmeci. We continue to hold talks with the important guests around the world on international political matters. And today we have a very valuable guest from the United States. I hosted him before. I'm sure you know about him. Professor Herbert Reginbogin from American Catholic University. Professor Reginbogin, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor. We named today's talk as Living in a Trumpian World. So, as a famous professor who wrote extensively on international law, U.S. politics, Second World War, Nuremberg Trials, U.S. foreign policy, as well as Turkish-American relations more recently, Professor Reginbogin, and as a U.S. citizen, uh, I want to first ask you about your thoughts about President Trump. Of course, he's a very controversial figure, but one thing is for sure, he knows how to make the headlines each day with a new sensational or sometimes maybe scandalous speech, appointment, or something. But as an American citizen, Professor, what are your thoughts about President Trump's picks for his second term presidency cabinet?
Well, you've chosen the people that trust him in comparison to his first administration, where others did not trust him and they had to be substituted because of the distrust. Now he has a cohesive power base of congressmen, both in the House and in the Senate, as well as in the cabinet. And even if they disagree, they will not vocal that disagreement publicly, and not even privately, I assume, because the president is very clear on what his goals are, and he is relentless in making this happen, which is very demonstrated by what he has done in the last less than 60 days in office. Like a businessman, he is now a politician, and he wants to make this thing happen. And unlike the Democrats, which were in power so often, or even the Republicans, they never really solved the problem, the deficit, the entitlements, an entire question of how to deal with these issues of an oversized bureaucracy. If this is a problem that can be resolved, well, it has not been resolved. And it continues to be a deficit every year in the trillions of dollars. Thus, he has now called out all of the players, all of the agencies to do the job. And it's been a radical experience for many. For some, they have lost their jobs. For others, it's a matter of only a few months. And yet, the economy is strong at this moment, with tariffs rising, question mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor, we both study international politics and U.S. foreign policy. I mostly study Turkish-American relations, of course, but I also had chance to analyze the various aspects of U.S. foreign policy. So President Trump has a somehow peculiar or different approach to foreign policy, as you mentioned his identity as a businessman. And during his first presidency, I remember he mentioned the concept principled realism. Now, in his second term, his approach to Ukraine war, or in Palestine, gives me the idea that he has a kind of realistic approach in foreign policy, and he believes that a lasting peace can be built only the demands of the maybe stronger side on the field can be satisfied. Uh, Of course, this has contradictions with classical traditional U.S. foreign policy. And by the way, he named the person who represents the traditional U.S. foreign policy values, I think Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. So, I mean, what can we understand from President Trump's foreign policy understanding? Is it possible to conceptualize or theorize about his approach to political matters?
Well, let's be clear first on the concept you shared a moment ago called principle realism. And that is really where the states are the actors. That means they have the power. And the assumption in this theory is that the world is anarchic. And as such, self-interest presumably is pursued in terms of power and security, but often at the question or at the expense of moral and ethical consideration. Now is the question, do we want to live in the world of Napoleon, Bismarck, Adolf Hitler, and the Kaiser? Do we want to live in that era of empires rivaling in the 19th century, where 2 world wars occurred in Europe in the 20th century? Do we really want to have no ethics and morals for our children? Is this our world order, where we are really only interested in power? Or are we really interested in values? Or is that the NATO that we have not really set up to really codify the values we share because of the experience of World War II? People have to think about this seriously. It's not a humor of saying, well, Canada can become the 51st state. Oh, and why don't we send the military right now? Military has the orders by the president to search out all strategic planning to acquire the Panama Canal or to defend it against Chinese influence. That means invasion is on the table. And what about Greenland? Oh, we're going to take Greenland. That sounds very imperialistic to me in the 19th century. Is America an imperialist nation? Has it lost its focus and bearings because of national security? Or better said, do we give up some of our rights because of fear and then we lose all of them? Sir, it's for me, Ozan, it's very clear. We have major problems in this country, and President Donald Trump is approaching it with a very new approach. And I think we should give him time before we prejudge. But let us be clear, there are warning signals. And if our courts are now reversing those decisions, suspending them, there is a court. That's a democracy. What you are talking about, or what we are discussing, is about a power relationship that resembles Yalta, dividing up the world. And if Yalta has anything about dividing up the world, it's not about the sovereignty of nations. It's about the sphere of influence. And that's the 19th century modus operandi. And everybody says Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine has been rejected by most presidents in the 21st century, except for Donald Trump. And again, it's not been reversed by Congress. It has been in existence. So it's not a flaw that President Trump is using this. And again, this is a U.S. policy, not an international law, a U.S. policy. And if U.S. policy contradicts international law, now you have a big problem with your allies and world community. And if you want democracies to reign in the world of the 21st century, you better figure out how you work with democracies and not with authoritarian dictatorships that suppress or even kill their own people.
In principle, I totally agree with you, Professor. But when we look at the political realities, which realism necessitates, the idealist approach to political matters in foreign policy and international politics have caused some large confrontations and polarizations in the world system. So Russia and its bloc, the emergence and strengthening of BRICS and now BRICS Plus, and the support Russia was given by many other non-democratic regimes and also some democratic regimes, by the way, from the global south, from President Trump's perspective, created a more dangerous conjuncture in terms of world stability. What I get from his press releases from White House and his speeches before the public, before the press, what I get, that he thinks that the continuation of the war could be more dangerous for Ukrainian people and for, also for the whole world, because Russia is one of the most nuclear country in the world. So I mean, doesn't it make sense? Yes, principles, as you focus on your books, which are absolutely helpful to understand world history. You mentioned the necessity of international law, some principles that should be protected. But again, doesn't it risky? By the way, Russia is a member of a UN Security Council. That's why maybe a decision couldn't take, a resolution couldn't be at the council because of Russian presence.
What you're talking about goes back to the Peloponnesian War. And this is a very clear understanding. They say might makes right, or better said, the victors do what they want and the others have to do what they're told to do. The question is, does the world want to be told what to do? Europe, 23% of the GDP. America, 25. 450 million people, 300 million in the USA. You think they're going to sit there and just, turn their thumbs around in circles? Of course, the political will is not there, but then again, you're challenging the world order. That's the international world order. Do you want your children to live like in the 19th century? Or do you want them to have a moral, ethical background for which there are values? And I mean real values, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of travel. You don't have that in dictatorships. You don't have that in Russia. You don't have that in China. You don't have that in Iran, in North Korea, and et cetera, et cetera. Is that what you want? Well, you can have it. That's your choices. As the people, you have choices right now. Do something about it. And don't tell me you can't do anything, because you can. As long as you have that freedom, you can. And that's what everybody doesn't really want to do. Or they better said, well, they're not going to bother me. And then they'll come for another group, and then finally they come and pick me up. World War II, the Holocaust. So in other words, lessons of history are very clear. And we don't have to misread them for what they really are. They're principles. And those principles are the foundation of what the UN Charter is about. UN Charter, we all signed up in 1948 or 1945. And there's no discussion about that. The problem, I think what we have to look at is the threat that America poses to Russia. And understandably, like John Mearsheimer explains, there is a NATO expansion. Great, I understand. But at the same time, the KGB, or today FSB, never gave up its mission to destabilize the West. So don't think it's just one-way street. We have secret services that do their job to make sure that security in this interest, which is a gray zone, is happening right now as we speak. So if you want to control these kind of institutions, and they don't become interlocutors for our official world, then you have to control them. And you have to put them together. In 1997, we had an agreement with Russia to bring them on board as G8. We had tried to integrate, but some people in America and some people in Russia and elsewhere said, we need an adversary. We don't trust them. That was our misfortune, a moment in time, which was lost. And don't think because NATO's expanding that Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, doesn't have his dreams of expansionism, just like the United States has. If it could, it would, but it can't, because of the barrier called international law. And he just says, let's suspend the International Criminal Court. Well, that happens to be the body of law enforcement. And that was just recently seen in the case of Philippines and arresting Duarte for killing millions of people as he was president. That's inhumanity. And now it's time to get back in terms of taking control of the power. And the question is, who can do this? Well, if the Security Council is incapable of doing this, the General Assembly can, and it has precedents. So I'll just stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I mean, again, in principle, I'm totally okay with you. But let me remind you, Professor, in 2003, when US attacked Iraq in the Iraqi war, and Iraq had a terrible dictator, Saddam Hussein, who was doing terrible things in the past, and also at that time towards Kurds, Kuwait, other nations, and to its own people, his own people. But when there was no UN Security Council decision and US made this move, maybe the international system began to crumble at this point. So Russia's support given to Russia maybe increased after that move. And no one, as far as I know, President Bush or his supporters, Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair of the era, they were not charged at International Criminal Court, right? Now they are trying to charge, Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu. Isn't it a contradiction? I'm just, of course, playing the devil's advocate here. So let me understand your point of view.
Well, you're right in terms of those violations and the alleged crimes. And again, we're looking at how a young court, remember, this is a very young court, which was founded and began to do its work in the early part of 2000. So again, you're talking about in very unsophisticated, really not having the power that it really would require to do its job. And there's no excuse for it. So again, there are fault lines in all international organizations. It will require states, European states, UK, other states, Germany, France, powerful countries, Japan, etc. If they want to step up to the plate to the United States and make sure that this international organization called ICC, International Criminal Court, fulfills its UN mission, then it has to support it because they are the state actors. They have the power. And again, if the United States challenges the world, the free world, guess what? It will not have allies like it had in the last 80 years. And they will become a power base to challenge US expansion. And they might face themselves in the exact position that we are now facing, or rather we had faced back in 2003, where again, like Colton Powell said, we lied about what was really happening in Iraq. And then everybody said, well, there's other reasons. There's no other reason. If you are breaking international law, if you are really a threat, immediate threat, good. Now you have a reason under the articles. But now you don't have that. And just to go about making arguments, no. You either have the principles and the facts on the ground and do your job, or don't do it, and then you fail. It's as simple as that. And it's critical.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor, President Trump and with his team, he started a new diplomatic process for reaching peace in Ukraine. Secretary of State Mr. Marco Rubio was in Saudi Arabia to meet with his Russian counterpart, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, and there were some productive talks, what we get from US press releases. And do you think US and Russia, with a kind of big power, the great power diplomacy, can solve the problem in Ukraine, can stop the bloodshed happening in Ukrainian soil?
Well, that's a very big question with a lot of variables. Let's try to take it a little bit apart. So, does a independent, sovereign country want to be dictated by a superpower? Does really Russia or the Soviet Union not have that kind of historical background? And should now the United States implement the same coercion? For good reasons. We should end the war, stop the bloodshed. Great. But again, at what price? At what cost? Or do we allow Ukraine to become a complete dictator, completely assumed by Russia? That's also ending the war. What is the price for peace? Somewhere somebody said that back in the 1930s when it came to Munich. So the price for peace, that's what we're asking. And if the price for peace is, well, giving up some territory, well, who's to decide? America? It's the Ukrainian territory. It's the Ukrainian people. It's their decision. Sure, you can say, I want to help them, but helping them means that you have to have them agree with you. But the way that's being agreed is more coercion. So it's happening. Yes, that's power. And you are coercing Zelensky and his country to give up territory so that Russia will stop fighting, at least have a ceasefire. And this is the way we're going. The only question is, do the people really want this? Do the people who are Russian-speaking, and there are many in the western part of Ukraine, which is not occupied by Russia, as well as those in the eastern, which is occupied by Russia and annexed by Russia illegally, only unilaterally. There have not been any referendum under the observation of Organization Security of European Cooperation, better known as OSCE. They have been only their own, and there is questions about its legitimacy. So if you really want to go back and do this, you've got to start thinking about having intermediaries suspend these occupations, and again, give the time for a referendum, a time for where really people can make choices. Do they really want to be a part of these kind of territorial expansions by the part of Russia? Well, let's not forget, there was no immediate threat to Russia. There was some expansion, but no military threat to Russia. And that Russian invasion is a war crime. That's very clear. Now, President Trump will not want to look at that. He will overlook it. And that's a part of, like I said, no moral considerations. It's about power. And if we can solve this problem with use of power, everybody will say yay. But at what cost? And again, are there other ways of approaching it? I've written about it. You can do many different things than just using the selectivity of bargaining another Yalta conference.
What about neutrality of Ukraine, Professor? You wrote extensively on neutrality.
On permanent neutrality, which again excludes NATO, but also means that the country is given the necessary weapons, the necessary assets to protect itself. And if Russia is threatened by those assets, well, guess what? Russia has nuclear weapons. There's no comparison. And it has an enormous army, enormous people. Only the ingenuity of the Ukrainians is a threat. They're smart. And they've proven that in the last 3 years. So again, this is about how Russia wants to live in the new world order. And if Russia wants to live in a world order that is peaceful and has continuity for peace, there are ways of doing it. For example, you take all those occupied territories under Russian occupation, and you set up what was known as in World War II as a Polish corridor, or not a Polish corridor, but as a mandate where this entire territory is under the supervision of the United Nations. And there is no troops in Russia, in those occupied territories of Ukraine. And there's a demilitarization on the part of Ukraine, pulling back troops, and it's all monitored by the OSCE. And in those areas, those territories, then the League of Nations will make sure the people can have their education, practice their religion, choose their way of life. And after a few years, when people have returned to those areas, because that's their home, they will have really a chance to have a referendum. And that's the whole idea of a concept. And peacekeepers can come from other countries. And if you talk about security guarantees, I guess the best way of putting it this way, if the United States says, look, you do this one more time, there's no way we're going to stop sending in the necessary assets. If that's a guarantee, so be it. But then a guarantee by Russia is that we're going to guarantee that Ukraine remains permanently neutral. That's also a guarantee. And together, it's not a question of being adversaries, it's a matter of how we can cooperate where we have missed the opportunity back in the 1990s. Let's try to stop the adversary, and let's see if we can become more friends.
After the talks in Riyadh, Professor, Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, His Excellency, told the press that we didn't only hear each other, we started to understand each other. And I think the main problem lies in the fact that Ukrainians see this as a battle of morals, as you mentioned, of principles, sovereignty, independence, liberalism, etc. But Russians look from a geopolitical perspective. They are not fighting against, in fact, from their point of view, against Ukrainian people. They don't want to have a long border with NATO forces. I think that's the main problem. That's why I'm not even sure whether Russians are looking for more territories, but rather safety against NATO and permanent neutrality maybe of Ukraine. So maybe in that sense, President Trump's power-centered approach, since Russia has a closer stance to that perspective, from my perspective, can be successful. The talks in Ukraine, of course, with the support of the Ukrainian leadership and people, and this might be also for their favor. But of course, these are my views. But another plan that President Trump proposed, we don't know too much about the details, but together with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he told the press several weeks ago about his Riviera plan in Gaza. So this drew a lot of criticism in Turkey and elsewhere in the Islamic world. Of course, we are now in the holy month of Ramadan, so Muslims are praying, and this was seen as, forcefully migrating Muslims from Gaza, Palestinians from Gaza, sending to Egypt and Jordan forever, and to give this land to Israel, which President Trump never said this, by the way. He said, we will get in. He never said, we will make it Israeli territory. But do you think, again, maybe he has this power-centered approach on this matter? Again, what are your thoughts on this so-called Riviera plan?
Well, before I answer that question, let me just go back to one differentiation in your last statements.
Please.
On Ukraine. If you ask an American, what do you believe? They'll say in freedom. You go to the Russians, are they going to say security or freedom? Question mark. But I'll say that the government of Russia is more interested in security at the price of freedom. In America, it's not that.
Yes.
That's where we have to understand the difference between the Russian government and the Russian people, and vice versa. So that's a big, big understanding. And in terms of the question you're asking about Gaza, well, I think he played poker pretty nicely, Donald Trump. He said, 80 years, the Arab nations, the neighbors of Palestine, what have they done for these millions of people living in tents? What? It's not America, it's the neighbors. It's your backyard. And he sees Israel as always under threat, which it is, continuously. We have proxy wars. We have nations in the neighborhood are trying to destroy Israel. It's extremism. We have ISIS. These are your territories. This is the background of Middle East. Not somewhere in the US or North America or in Canada. It's in the Middle East, the extremists. And for that, he says, okay, you didn't do anything for 80 years? Well, we'll do the following. We'll have everybody leave. We'll take over America. We'll make sure it becomes a Riviera, a beautiful destination for a lot of people to come and spend money. In the meantime, yes, you can come back. And that's a question mark. Or the Arab people or the Arab nations actually fulfill what they should have done over the last 80 years. Is take control financially, investments into the area of Gaza and Palestine, stabilize, creating a second state, and making sure it's strong and has sovereignty and the education that is necessary. But no, like every dictatorship in that region, which is a monarchy or whatever you want to call it, is influenced by not by the people, but by their own dynasties. Be clear, there are no democracies, with the exception, I'm talking not of Turkey in the Middle East. I'm talking about the Middle East without Turkey. And that is the fact. The only living democracy in this region is Israel. And even that has some question marks behind it. But every democracy, even the United States as well, has a question mark. But it remains a democracy. The freedom of speech, the freedom of traveling, the freedom on your rights as an individual. You don't have that. And that's a really important part of what Donald Trump successfully brings out in his policies. He really brings it to the brink of saying you either do or you don't. And if you do, then let's do it. You do it, not me. I've been doing this too much for you. It's your problem. Figure it out. Solve it. And that's exactly his problem with NATO, his issues with other countries. And he's talking about this in a very radical form. Is it justified? That's a question mark. That we'll see. But in terms of what the Gaza is about, I think it is. And I don't think America's interested in going into Gaza at all. But he's pushing the button. And he's making it sure that if those buttons are going to be taken up by Israel because there's a vacuum, the Arab nations know they don't want Israel in there. So they have to do something constructively on a large dimension. So yes, President Trump has played his cards right.
I agree with you, Professor. I think his plan was also one of the main aim in announcing this plan was to maybe provocate Arab states to come up with a real peace plan to make Palestine a real viable state as a part of a two-state solution. But the whole world once again saw that with the after President Trump's speech. In fact, Arab countries do not care about Palestinian problems or Arab problems or Muslim problems. Only countries like Turkey and Iran and maybe somehow Qatar has shown some interest in the solution of the process. The other states don't do anything. But they recently announced a new Arab plan for Gaza, maybe after huge reactions coming from their people. But of course, without US support or Turkish support, I'm not sure how influential it could be. One last question, Professor. We are running out of time. Turkish-American relations, of course, with October 7 and ongoing war in Gaza, it's still a difficult conjuncture. Last year we were trying to make this international conference on Turkish-American relations. We felt it very closely how difficult to do something productive. But you work hand in hand with Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C. So you helped Ambassador Mercan before, and now you are close to Ambassador Önal. And President Trump and President Erdogan has a intimate relation. They are good friends. They like each other's style and they respect each other despite having different political views and lifestyles. So should we expect something positive in the coming months in terms of Turkish-American relations?
I think we should not indulge my relationships with the ambassadors because first of all, no ambassador is to the extent being advised by me or that I have some kind of special relationship. What I did have with Ambassador Mercan is an open discussion, and I appreciated many of his concepts, and I believe vice versa. In the case of Ambassador Senal, Unal, he is a very reserved ambassador. That is his style. That was also his style in New York when he was.
He's a career diplomat,
right.
Yes.
So, even a career diplomat, there are many ways they can be in their daily lives different. In this case, it's very reserved. Well, that's not an issue. He's doing his job the way he believes he's successful, and he's recognized by the government of Turkey as being successful, or he wouldn't be remaining in that position. Moving on to the question of American-Turkish relations, I think the big question here is how do we deal with the issues that are currently on the table, and how are we going to move ahead in strengthening this relationship, not in terms of a strategic relationship, but again, back to the people. How do we create it to become a friendship? I mean, a real friendship. So it's something like the UK and USA. So if you want this type of special relationship, which is based on values, and religious freedom is one of the very basic cores of our country and of Turkey, well, religious freedom is a question. How much religious freedom is there in Turkey versus here in the United States? Then the question is, how much freedom of speech? That's another question. So we're coming down to values. And again, this is all that has to be understood. And the political practices domestically is quite different. And there is a lot of political domestic challenges going on right now between the parties, AKP and
CHP, CHP.
Right, CHP. But again, these are domestic issues, and they have, of course, instrumentalized foreign policy. And that has also become another problem in US-Turkish relations. And then there's the Kurds in the YPG and that in what's happening in Syria, and how is that being, again, mastered? So again, if the US and Turkey wants to get down to the problems objectively and speak publicly with words that are not of political interest to some kind of constituency, but really wants to look at the problems between our two countries to make them really resolved and get to the point that we can really say we not only believe in what we do, we trust each other, because that's what we don't have, the trust. And we need it. We need it for the direct investments in Turkey, and 100 billion is peanuts. Tell me about trillions, and I'll tell you my smile. That's what we're talking about. You have a wonderful industry, you're high tech, you can do it, you need better education, you have to move this out, you know how to do it. You've got a lousy currency, you don't need that. You can resolve these problems, but you've got to change the political game. And that's not a secret, everybody knows it. And again, Turkey has all the potential of becoming one of the most important emerging countries in the 21st century. It has the technology, it has the know-how.
Thank you, Professor. I hope this year we're going to organize this international conference, this time at Istanbul Kent University, and this will help the fixing of the relations between our two countries. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much. I wish you a very nice weekend. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.